Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Tabadlab Live. Today I'm super excited to have somebody I consider a friend, but more importantly, one of the most interesting researchers and academics and public intellectuals that Pakistan has the privilege of calling it its own, Dr. Adeel Malik. Doc Saab, thank you for joining. I think I could go into long sort of introduction, but the best way to introduce Adeel Malik is to say that in recent years, a steady stream of research productivity that relates directly with some of the big questions that Pakistan faces. And I say this as an intro because I'm not going to let you get away with just this conversation. There's a bunch of papers you've written in the last 3 years. I think COVID was a very productive time for you.
Correct.
And I want to talk about a lot of them. But today, I wanted to ask Dr. Malik to explore, explain, and walk us through the paper that he recently presented at the LUMS Ideas SERP CDPR conference called Pathways to Development. This year was the second consecutive year for this conference. I think that conference is growing into a really important venue for the way in which Pakistanis understand what is happening to this country, but in particular to economic growth in this country. And one big issue that everyone talks about is, well, Pakistan doesn't export enough. Until Pakistan doesn't export enough, it's not going to be able to get out of this trap. And so Dr. Malik has been working on trade policy for the Rasta PIDE, the Pakistan Institute for Development Economics Research Consortium. As a part of that, Dr. Malik worked on this issue of trade policy, and in particular on the question of why, despite liberalization, and I'll ask him to explain what that means, but why despite liberalization, there's so much trade protection for certain industries and certain sectors, and then what the impact of that protection is on the economy. Dr. Saab, so before I just want to launch right in, but before we do, I want to read this excerpt from a World Bank sort of report that we helped launch a couple of years ago, and that you've cited in your blog, in which you describe this research, because I think it really captures a really important way of thinking about this challenge that we have in this country. And the quote from this World Bank report is that, let me make sure that I have the right one. The quote from this is, there's a marked anti-export bias in tariff policy, and Pakistan has the world's highest levels of effective protection to domestic industries. The world's highest levels of effective protection to domestic industries. That makes exporting only a residual option. That is, protection granted with the objective of import substitution has ended up substituting exports instead. So this is a really, I think, powerful point, and it's almost like your research picks up where this sentence leaves off. So I'll ask you to explain that a little bit further, but first just talk us through this term liberalization, because the premise is a lot of liberalization has happened, but it hasn't led to the outcomes that it has in other countries. Is that a fair description?
That is correct. And in fact, if you would allow me to step back a little bit and explain your viewers that why an open-oriented trade policy is important. Some of the richest countries that we've seen in the world, whether it's the United States, whether it's China, Germany, these are all big export-oriented economies. They developed through a more outward-oriented trade policy, which is they were more free to trade. In fact, even in the early Islamic history, we've been free to trade. That doesn't mean that one should selectively protect certain industries that might be infant and they can grow over time and develop the comparative advantage. That certainly remains on the table. But generally, economies that have gained prosperity are those that have been open. And look at some of the recent economies like Turkey, since Turgat Özal, Vietnam, China, Bangladesh now. These are all economies that have traded more with the outside world. So that's the first thing I want to say, that that's the larger literature points to that direction, that the more competition there is with the outside market, the more industry has an opportunity to grow. There still is a case for protecting some industries, but it's always time bound and it's focused on how you protect, how long you protect. But in general, outward oriented economies are more prosperous.
I just want to add a couple of caveats that are mine, but feel free to say I don't know what I'm talking about. It seems to me like if you have a free trade, let's say with selective countries, like you have free trade agreements, if those countries are just better than you at some things, or if they're better than you at almost everything, then is that also a case to at least be more selective in terms of open trade with those countries? I'm thinking of two big ones. In Pakistan's case, there's the China example, which we've already done, where there's a huge FTA and a huge imbalance, and I think a negative impact on domestic productivity and manufacturing. And the other one is the prospective opening up of trade with India. In both cases, my fear is what happened with China will happen to a greater degree with India for many reasons. And so is there a case that not only should you protect certain industries, but you should also be smart about whom you open up to? Or is that just isolationist nonsense?
I think it's all it depends on how you open up. There are thousands of FTAs across the world, but how you open up, which interests are driving that integration is important. But for your listeners, I think it's important to emphasize the insulated debate that we have in Pakistan. Look, the country as it is sitting next to the two largest emerging economies in the world, China and India. And we have an emerging corridor on our western frontier as well. Yet, the country acts as a landlocked country effectively. Take any major landlocked country in Africa and look at its outcomes. It's closed, it's protected, it's rentier. We, despite our favorable geography, effectively, although we do have a long coastline, effectively we act as a landlocked country. That's an equilibrium that might suit its elites. But if you want to discuss prosperity, democratization, creating jobs for the young people, improving industry, feeding 240 million people, we have to come out of that insular equilibrium.
And that means opening up, including with
everyone, whether it's China or India, but how you open up, which industries drive, it's, the devil is in the detail.
Okay. Fantastic. I think that's a really valuable sort of starting point. So more trade is generically better, and it's proven throughout history. Now,
your question about
liberalization. What does this mean, liberalization? Because a lot of, I think, conservative brothers and sisters might be like, we've seen what liberalization does. We don't want to be like that.
That's right.
I think that's a misunderstanding of the word.
Absolutely. So when we think about liberalization, it means you are liberalizing, you are opening up the economy. Now, opening up means we were closed before. And so a lot of developing countries in the 60s and 70s raised high import barriers, high tariffs, which are basically effectively taxes on imports, right? So there's like 60% tax on importing something. A lot of these economies were closed, but there was a powerful strain of literature, mainly pioneered by people like Anne Kruger and others, that this promoted rent seeking. So the idea was that in Turkey and India, these were the two classic examples where in the name of supporting industrial development, countries imposed high tariffs, protected them, gave subsidies to their industries. This had two impacts. One is that it closed off the economy and created what we describe as rents, extra income streams, right? Because the moment you are a monopolist in a country, you're the only importer, you get money not for working hard, just to get, because of getting that protection. And so it incentivizes your industrialists to travel to the capital all the time and lobby for those favors. India has had that famous license Raj regime, right, where industrialists are traveling to New Delhi, asking for favors. and involving in what we call rent seeking, which is unproductive activity. Now that was the time of the 70s and in the 80s. And there was growing emphasis after the fall of Soviet Union that you need to liberalize trade. And there was pressure on countries to liberalize. And that liberalization primarily meant privatization, it meant deregulation of the economy. The effects were very different, right?
It also meant a removal of trade barriers.
It also,
or tariffs.
particularly trade liberalization, involved removing trade barriers, making it easier for those countries to trade with the rest of the world.
And this is what the kind of WTO agenda was.
The World Trade Organization created a rule-based framework where countries could trade with each other, resolve their conflicts. We are now entering into a stage where, because of the US-China competition, we are saying, well, this was hyper-globalization. We need to go back.
So now we're deliberalizing.
So we are coming out of this era of hyper-globalization, what people are calling deglobalization. But my argument is that for large number of developing countries, they never truly liberalized in a sensible way. It was a very shallow or partial liberalization where we liberalized in reduced trade barriers in some sectors and maintained protection in others.
So I have a key question here, Doc. You're familiar with Pritchett's framing of isomorphic mimicry, which it's like one of my go-to, because oftentimes I think it isn't so much that there's some rank evil or some very by design policy sophistication that is producing the kind of outcomes. Pakistan's very unique for the size of the economy, for the geography. It actually boggles the mind that this isn't growing at 15% a year, right? And so, but often my go-to explanation for this is, it's because the Pakistani elites have essentially just copied and pasted. It's isomorphic mimicry. Somebody said liberalize, so somebody took out a liberalization paper, they copied and pasted and then replaced the word, whatever the other word was, with the word Pakistan, brought it here, and it didn't really work. But when I read your paper, I felt like maybe that was too simplistic an explanation. Would you agree?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that a lot of these countries face pressures to liberalize from WTO, from the IMF, World Bank programs, and it happened across Africa, Latin America, also happened in Pakistan. But there wasn't genuine ownership of this reform agenda. And once it was imposed, then there are actors who are powerful enough to use that to their benefit, right? Because always whenever there's a pressure to liberalize from the outside, and this happened in Egypt, in Morocco, a whole range of other countries, they would try to comply with that pressure. They would liberalize, but half-heartedly. And so there's a fabulous book by Nicholas van der Wal on the politics of economic reform in Africa, where he talks about why African countries, typically people blame the IMF and other institutions for failure of reform in Africa, and some of that criticism is valid. But part of the failure is because the domestic constituencies, domestic policymakers were never truly sincere with the idea of reform. So they implemented partially to comply with international regulations while keeping the domestic system of patronage intact.
And so your paper goes through, I guess, the mechanics of how that's been enacted in Pakistan.
That's correct.
And the short version, in the kind of trade policy for dummies version, what we hear is SROs. This is a term that, I also use as a simplification or shorthand, that when, let's say, the international organizations came and said, listen, if you want to play ball with the global system, you have to reduce import duties, and you have to reduce basically customs and tariffs, because we're entering into this era of liberalization. But then what that meant was that a lot of protected industries, like somebody makes, I don't know, maybe this, tissue paper. Prior to liberalization, you had these duties that protected the tissue paper maker. Now you had to find a different way of protecting the tissue maker, is what I'm hearing you say. So how does your paper kind of go into this, and what actually ends up happening in Pakistan? let's say, I mean, the 90s are too far back, but I think your paper does a really interesting job of mapping everything like in the transition that took place in 2013. So I'll let you just walk us through that period.
That's a great example of a tissue paper. In a way, uninterrupted liberalization of trade began during the Mosharraf years. That's when a genuine attempt was made in 2001 to liberalize tariffs.
Okay.
And this succeeded for a few years.
Was this driven at the time? Sorry, I have so many questions. Was this driven by some ideological or conceptual clarity at the, I don't know, in Shaukat Aziz's mind or Dr. Salman Shah's mind? Or was it imposed by the PRGF, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Facility that, I think kicked in 2000 or 2001? And that was the big IMF program that really rescued Pakistan from where it was in the late 90s.
I think there was certainly support from outside because by this time, international institutions had felt that countries should liberalize their trade. But I have a feeling that this was more a decision by many of the technocrats that were associated with Mosharraf's regime.
So Dr. Ishaq Hussain, Salman Shah, Shaukat Aziz.
Absolutely. So
maybe Ashfaq Hasan Khan.
Ashfaq Hasan Khan. And they knew that we have to, if we want structural reform in this country, and if we want industrial development, we need to liberalize trade. We need to trade with the outside world. And this, because I know from conversations with different people who managed trade policy at the time, they went and met with industrialists, tried to convince them, look, it's not in our interest. We need to reduce protection, let you compete with the international market, and that would be good for industry. So this succeeded for a few years.
Okay.
But just before the departure of Pervez Musharraf, 2007, we began to see the sort of a current account deficit problem, right? So we have a lot more imports, few exports. You're facing current account challenges, reserves are falling. And then there's a pressure to compress imports. Like during Mifta's time as well, there was a lot of pressure. Oh, we cannot pay for our imports, let's compress imports and luxury items. So this happened in 2008, in the Zardari period. That was the first time that a new device was introduced, which was called regulatory duties. So the tariffs are taxes on imports, right? The 60%, 80%, 20%. And those taxes on imports were actually coming down.
Okay.
And you could not have increased them because the international institutions would, because we were going into an IMF program in 2008, they would not allow you to increase tariffs.
Okay.
And they were saying, no, Mosharraf has liberalized, we cannot increase tariffs. They said, okay, we will do some emergency duties, which are like tariffs. I mean, regulatory duty is again a duty on imports. It's another name for an import duty. But there is a difference. The difference is, if you want to impose tariffs, you need a parliamentary approval.
Okay.
For regulatory duties, because it's an emergency measure, it's a cabinet
notification.
Approval. It's a cabinet approval. So they are more discretionary, they are more non-transparent. And people say, well, we will just increase them. It's under this difficult circumstance. In 2008, the first time when they increased. But it was really in 2013 and 16 that we witnessed a really profound wave of regulatory duties.
And this is different from the SROs.
Now, here is the thing.
Just explain what an SRO is.
So the SRO, if you want to understand the way in which our elite captures and controls the economy, is the SRO.
Okay.
It's called Statutory Regulatory Order.
Okay.
It says, let's say if you are a businessman and you want to import something, you want preferential treatment, you have access to levers of power. You will just ask them to issue an SRO that in this industry where Mosharraf works, without naming you, Industrial Code 2430 has exemption of any customs duty for this year, or has a trade policy exemption.
But this also has to go through cabinet.
So this again is, this I think the SROs...
No, actually, SROs don't have to go through cabinet.
No.
Aren't SROs just issued by the FBI?
Yeah, exactly. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the SROs can just be done without, definitely not the parliament, and probably not even the cabinet approval. So these are really discretionary measures, and the common man doesn't even know what is happening. And so there are all sorts of SROs floating around.
And what's the quantum of SROs that are out there? There's maybe 5 or 10, 15?
There was an excellent paper by the IGC, Saad Gulzar, and a couple of other people did that paper. And they, for the first time, tried to document where are these SROs. And basically, the largest number of tariff lines, and tariff lines are basically all these products that we import or export. They are subjected to some form of SRO. So there are thousands of them.
Thousands of SROs?
Thousands of SROs that existed in that domain. They have been simplified now. The 2013, you asked me about what happened in 2013. I think it's a really watershed moment for trade policy. If you want to understand trade policy over the last 30 years, and you would ask me what are the 2 years, it's 2001, when uninterrupted tariff liberalization began under Mosharraf, and 2013, when a process of reversal began.
But the reversal was quite clever from what you're saying, because if it wasn't, we wouldn't have gotten GSP Plus, we wouldn't have gotten the IMF loan, we wouldn't have gotten a lot of these engagements that we've had with the global financial system. No?
You've hit the nail on its head. I mean, basically, this was a process of what I describe as trade policy substitution. That your tariffs are declining, you cannot increase them again because there's pressure from the World Bank and the IMF and other international partners as well. But you substitute the decline in tariffs by introducing other types of trade measures that may look different from tariffs, but they are non-transparent, they are discretionary, and their effect is the same. They increase trade protection.
So this is what we broadly call NTMs or NTBs, non-tariff measures or non-tariff barriers to trade.
Yes, so there's a clear distinction. In the 1990s, many countries had non-tariff barriers. They had a protectionist intent. You want to protect your import, like tariff.
Isn't that what the Pakistani elite also say about all these SROs and regulatory duties, that these are there to protect our industry?
They have a protectionist intent, because if you...
Well, a claimed protectionist intent.
That's right, because as soon as you have introduced a tax on imports, there is a protectionist intent.
Sure.
And the NTBs had that, like quotas and others. But non-tariff measures were more innocuous, considered more innocuous, because these are regulatory requirements. Like you are importing a fridge and it has a label which says it is energy efficient, A, B, or C, particular level of energy efficiency. So there's a labeling requirement. Or if you're exporting mangoes, you need to meet sanitary and phytosanitary requirements.
So these are added costs to...
Exactly. So they might be done for reasons that are good for trade, to facilitate trade.
Like for climate change, for
regulatory harmonization, and the EU insists on a lot of these. But ultimately, many of these non-tariff measures, even if they do not have an explicit protectionist intent, they require what inspection requirements. Like if you are exporting a good and there is a quality requirement, you need inspection, and inspection from customs. And this enforcement can be selective. If you are a connected industry, that enforcement cost would be very low.
Sure. But in a sense, the argument then would be, like, I might say to you, Doc Saab, what's the complaint? It's quite clear that these measures are, it's really a matter of judgment, is it not? Whether they're innocuous and meant for policy instruments, or whether there's something more sinister going on. But I suspect that from reading your paper, it feels like there's something more sinister happening.
That's right. So this is, by the way, a global phenomenon. All across the developing countries, decline in tariffs has been substituted for by increase in non-tariff measures. But non-tariff measures increase a lot more in some sectors than others, and their effect depends on regulatory enforcement. It's a bit like the FATF. The FATF introduced a lot of useful reforms, but it also introduced frictions, because then it makes banking transactions more difficult. There's a lot more hoops to cover. But the non-tariff measures, the key thing to remember is that it requires inspection requirements. They require administrative oversight, and therefore can be subjected to political abuse. So that's where 2013 is a watershed moment, because in 2013, two things happened. One, the non-tariff measures increased, and second, regulatory duties began to increase a lot more. Now, why was this happening? It happened because in 2013, there was a new government in power,
Right.
PMLN. Nawaz Sharif's government had come to power. Ishaq Dar had been sworn in as the Minister for Finance. And the government decided to sign a program with the IMF. The IMF program, and if you read the IMF documents, was very explicit in advising the country to do a few things. The traditional mode of operation for the IMF is to focus on fiscal and broad macroeconomic policies. But in this program, apart from these broad macro policies, the IMF insisted on important trade reforms.
Why?
Together with the World Bank.
Why did they do that?
So it was partly because already in 2008, a lot of these early trade reforms were being repealed. From some of the reforms that started during Mosharraf years were already being retracted after the democratic transition.
Sometimes I say, Dr. Saab, the international community, whether it's the Saudis or the GCC countries, the Chinese or the IMF, they tend to study our economy and know our behavior, including the behaviors of our leaders, often much better than those of us that have been sitting here and comment on these things every day, like people like me. It sounds like the IMF may have included this in the negotiations in 2013 because, in a sense, they had had a chance to see Ishaq Dar in action at least twice before. Because you remember in 2008, originally, Ishaq Dar was also part of the cabinet. It was a coalition government in 2008, and then the coalition broke apart a few months in.
That's true, but it also represents some naivety on the part of international institutions, because they are also there are all sorts of ways in which their reform can be counteracted, and so they're also learning how the system operates. So they insisted on trade reform, which was very sensible. And there were three things. I mean, there are a lot of non-tariff barriers that were still there. They said repeal those, okay. And then they asked about SROs. Anybody who works within the fund of the bank and knows Pakistan's economy, they know that the system tries to protect the privilege by making it more complex. If you look at the SRO system, it's needless complexity, adding more and more complexity. And that complexity always favors those who want to game the system to derive their rent streams. So the IMF very sensibly said, look, you need to simplify this, simplify the tariff slabs, keep just a few, I think there were sort of 12 slabs, don't, make it a very simple system, remove non-tariff barriers, and then also these SROs, particularly trade-related policy exemptions. Because what are SROs? SROs are exemptions. You exempt one sector from one type of trade policy instrument, another sector, so on and so forth. And there are ways to grant privileges. In some cases, some SROs are good because they might be, for other reasons. But a lot of SROs are really to give exemptions to the privilege. Like the UNDP report talked about the total size of the privileges. Like, I think the number was $17 billion every year, elite benefits from that. One way it benefits is through SROs. So the IMF said, well, simplify that and remove these SROs, especially trade policy. So the government's response was very clever. They said, okay, we'll do that. And they took a lot of these trade policy exemptions, away and put them under a separate SRO and said, well, we will introduce regulatory duties.
Wait,
so this is more like an accounting.
Wait, sorry, this was a very organic laughter.
Right.
Because this is almost like not even Vegas. Vegas has more sophisticated games. But, when you go to these fairs or exhibitions and you have these low-level sort of card tricks,
right,
where now you see it, now you don't. And it's like in somebody's sleeve.
Yes.
I mean, I have two big questions here. So Dar Saab pulls this little card trick with the IMF. You mentioned the word naive when it came to the IMF. I mean, is it just naive, or is there, what stops the IMF from saying, hey, we know what you're doing and you can't do that? What's that dynamic like?
Right. I think it was in the flow of the moment, it is hard to do that.
Sure.
but it requires more political economy analysis. One of the things that my colleagues at the World Bank and IMF privately tell me is that our mandate is restricted. And so we don't have solid political economy analysis, which means you are looking at tariffs or taxes or trade policy in a very cold-blooded manner. You don't know how the system works, right? If you want to understand, for example, very few people in this country know there is something called the National Tariff Commission, which sets the policies. One of the most important policies of this country are set by the National Tariff Commission. Which sector should have how much tariff? Now, ideally, this should be based on a lot of economic rationale, economic analysis, which certainly some of it is there. But it is susceptible to political abuse, right? Because it's an administrative process. It's not open to people. So the fund, when it does defines its policy, it doesn't do solid political economy analysis of its policies. And that is a key constraint of international institutions. They are recognizing this, but there's a mandate issue.
Is it also, I don't know, I don't even know if it's wise to speculate in this way, but is it, for either of us, is it also the case maybe that with each passing program, IMF program, for example, or with each World Bank loan sort of negotiation, that these institutions are learning more? And so this idea in the Pakistani discourse that I'm sure you've heard is that, you know, the international system is turning against Pakistan and the levers are tightening. Maybe it's not unfounded, because if this is the kind of huckster level tricks that Pakistan's foreign finance ministers have been playing with the IMF, why wouldn't the international institutions then come back and say, all right, let's find an even more restrictive straitjacket so that they can't wiggle out of it this time? Aren't we almost forcing the international institutions to behave in more and more restrictive ways?
I mean, obviously, this dynamic then allows a new type of understanding. So, for example, some of the recent work done by Gonzalo and others at the World Bank on trade policy, they cannot say those things, but they've pretty much produced those analyses. The quote that you mentioned, that's learning on the part of international institutions too, because they're knowing how it works. The problem here, and I'll step back from the donors and more towards the domestic side, is that 2013 is a period when you sign the IMF program and there are certain trade reforms. You try and meet those requirements in a shallow way, right? Just to sign off. And then you increase regulatory duties. There's also a wave of non-tariff measures. Now, they are serving two purposes. One purpose is that you're meeting the IMF requirement for sort of implementing trade reform. The second purpose is that the IMF has asked you to increase your revenue. And many of these regulatory duties are an important source of revenue. Now, this, I would take a minute to explain this because it's a very, very important point. When you raise revenue through taxes, that means you do not want to raise revenue through other means, through direct taxes or other. And we already know that in Pakistan...
Sorry, when you raise taxes through...
not revenue, when you raise taxes through trade.
Right.
In the 1980s...
When you raise revenue through trade.
Revenues through trade.
As opposed to through direct taxes.
Through direct taxes. That means you're really shifting the burden of taxation, right? And in the 1980s, a lot of developing countries raised revenues through trade by imposing trade taxes. But that ratio has increased remarkably across the world. You look at India, you look at neighboring countries, Bangladesh, they don't raise revenues through through trade, right? Trade policies. We are continuing to do that. So I would say the single most criminal act on the part of the Dar administration was to use trade policy for revenue generation. That is criminal for a country because that means you're distorting the incentives of the productive sector. And, you know, the Commerce Ministry should be purely focused on what type of tariffs can give us greater competitiveness. What types of tariffs can help us promote exports?
But it's interesting. I mean, that is, it does sound criminal and sinister, but it sounds criminal for what it is, what you describe. It sounds more sinister because the reason you're doing it this way is dual nature. On the one hand, from what I've understood so far, you're raising revenue through trade barriers or trade measures because you don't want to tax rich people. So that in and of itself is a big problem. But then it's more exacerbated because the reason that you're doing this is also in some ways to protect your favored industries and favored groups.
That's correct.
So this is like, I mean, yeah, criminal is a very light word for this.
So this brings me, absolutely. So this brings me back to my paper and to your discussion about the IMF and the World Bank. Didn't they know it? Didn't they know it? And that's where micro level work, like disaggregate work, is important, because sometimes you don't even know what is happening. So what I did in my paper was to go and collect data from the WTO and other organizations, which is sector level data.
And how many sectors did
So
you
there are
look at?
119 manufacturing subsectors. So if you have a textile as a big sector, there's so many different components within textile. There is a yarn, there is
Knitwear,
fiber,
hosiery.
exactly.
Okay.
And so these are all subsectors. So I systematically collected data
For 100 and?
19 subsectors.
Wow. Okay.
So I collected data on what is the tariff on each sector, whether or not that sector had regulatory duty, whether or not it had non-tariff measure. So I collected all of that trade data.
And you collected this from 2013 till now?
I collected from 2001 all the way to 2021. And then I collected data on who owns, whether or not that sector is exposed to a politically influential actor.
So you cross-tabulated the tariff data essentially by industry.
Trade
Right, the trade data by industry. And then you kind of filtered it through this, who is influential politically.
Absolutely. And for that, I used 3 or 4 sources.
Okay.
I said, okay, we have had since Mosharraf years of practice to collect data on parliamentarians' assets.
Yeah.
And those parliamentarians' assets tell you,
Who owns what?
who owns what.
Right.
So that's one set of data. The other data, which the international literature...
How long did that take to clean? How many RAs did you have cleaning that up? Because you have one, almost like, you have one list of names against assets, then you have those subsectors, and each subsector has multiple assets in it, and then you're doing this cross-tabulation. Is that done?
2 RAs.
2 RAs, but are you using machine learning and AI in this, or?
Not in that. I mean, in future projects, I'll probably use that. But in this case, it was just that.
Sorry, I'm going into this detail because I think it's very important hopefully for those that are watching to understand the kind of work that goes into this.
Absolutely.
To really understand, because for you to use the language you've used and to say what you've said about this kind of watershed moment in 2013, I mean, you keep saying watershed, but I think this is a moment of great darkness. I mean, this is when the clouds really turn into a storm in terms of public policy in this country.
Absolutely. And so that's why I'm explaining that there's kind of, the devil is in the detail.
Yeah.
That even the fund or local actors,
they're not always going to have
they don't know what is happening.
time and space even to,
Exactly. And so that's, parliamentarian assets, one source of data. Another source of data.
But sorry, just in this regard, because these are ongoing, as you know, we're part of so many conversations. I think this is a moment for us to then recognize Rasta and Pied, because I think that, oftentimes, Nadeem is a very dear friend. Some of the noise kind of maybe distracts from the very important work that's being done. I mean, if it's not for that grant or that...
I mean, without that money, because you need some RAs to tabulate that. And I must also highlight that there has never been any serious work on political economy of trade in this country. It's unfortunate that I'm doing it for the first time.
Because this isn't your original sort of core focus in terms of economic history.
Right. So, well, I did some work on trade for Egypt and Morocco. So recently I've done some work. And one of my teachers at PIDE, when I was studying at Qaeda University, taught us, Dr. Zafar Mahmood, who's at NUST University. He first sensitized me to the idea of how trade policy can be captured by special interest groups, because he had studied from Columbia University under Jagdish Bhagwati, who's this one great trade economist.
And who actually, a lot of my thinking in very early on when I was, so to speak, an economist, was hinged on Bhagwati's work on the reverse brain drain. If you remember, in the mid-90s, he really started focusing on this.
Absolutely.
And that was...
So he sensitized it, and Dr. Zafar Mahmood did a lot of work on trade, but we did not have this sort of granular work on which subsectors are being protected and which actor is active in that sector. So parliamentarian assets were one source. The other source was I looked at World Guide to Trade Associations and systematically coded which sector has an association working in it. Like in sugar, you have Pakistan Sugar Mills Association, hosiery,
You have Aptima.
textile, etc., and the number of trade associations. But the third source, which I think was critical, without it there would have been no results, is this book in the 1990s when I was working with Mahbub al-Haq. We got exposed to a book. It was an piece of investigative journalism. Shahid ur-Rahman,
right,
who owns Pakistan.
Yeah.
So she documented about 42 or 43 big business groups who had holding companies, who were beneficiaries of privatization, and who controlled the heights of the economy. Now, these groups have good relations with every political party and with every power player. They are in the game for a long time. So I systematically coded which sectors are these groups operating. Then I looked at the evolution, and I hope you can show to the viewers some of these plots that I have in the paper, which clearly show that sectors that were politically exposed, i.e. they had, they were organized and that they had a Shahid ur-Rahman named family working in them, actually got higher level of compensatory trade protection in the guise of non-tariff measures and particularly regulatory.
So this, I want to explain this, or I want you to explain it. Compensatory trade measure. I know what you're saying, but it really, I wish I could draw this out right now, because it's essentially saying Dar Saab goes to the IMF and says, yeah, you got it. We'll not do these bad things anymore. Then turns around, walks into a closed door room with a Shahid ur-Rahman named family member, some group or the other, sits down with them and says, don't worry, I got you. And either issues an SRO or imposes a regulatory tax, regulatory duty on the import of something to help protect that family. Is that about right?
That's correct. Compensatory protection is basically, you are in an era where increasing tariffs would have been very difficult. Once Mosharraf had begun to liberalize, increasing tariffs in the international environment where we operate was very difficult. So as a policymaker, if I know I cannot increase tariffs, well, I can certainly increase regulatory duty, which is another device, nobody would notice it. And lo and behold, which sectors get more of those regulatory duties? These are sectors where some of these powerful families operate. Now, in LUMS, I got a very good comment on which I need to work more, is that in a way, it could be policy driving this, in the sense that they want to raise revenue, and some of these industries are operating in sectors that are big sectors. They generate a lot. They are able to generate more revenues by taxing those sectors. But it's certainly true that in every cabinet in Pakistan, including the present one, you always have a somebody on the saddle in the commerce ministry or another relevant finance and other ministries who protects the interests of these big lobbies. So does it matter? In fact, I find that these regulatory duties introduced by Ishaq Dar in 2016 actually continued even after the PTI government. It didn't matter, yes, they were introduced by Dar, they were introduced under the PMLN government, but those duties increased further in 2016, and they kept on increasing during the PTI years. So it doesn't matter which government is in power, because these interest groups are so powerful that they can have their say in every government.
This is obviously Razak Dawood was the trade minister in the first stretch of the Mosharraf era, and then he wasn't. And I think a lot of these changes take place during that time. And then, of course, Razak Dawood comes back in 2018. There's Dar Saab in 2013, and now there's Gauhar Ejaz, who's the commerce minister, and I think one of the sort of really core members of Aptima, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So obviously that protection is there. But I guess
I should also say that yes, the commerce it's not just done by the commerce ministry. It's always the commerce and finance. In some cases, the commerce is overruled, because if the finance ministry is desperate for revenues, they can overrule them. and say, okay, no, we will use these regulatory.
But isn't that just a classical sort of Pakistani elite sort of, ploy? That is to say that, no, in the same scenario, like there'll always be two or three actors so that one can say, oh, it wasn't me, it was him. The other one can, oh, it was because of this. I mean, I think it's also fair to say the FBR is a key player in all this as well. And oftentimes it will be not just the FBR, it'll be the state bank, it'll be the finance ministry, it'll be commerce. The net result is the same. So if somebody stands up and says, and we both have friends who have been in these positions, and they say, well, it wasn't me, I tried my best. Well, that's just a whole lot of, I'm not sure nonsense is the right word, but I also don't know the alternative, because this is a system-wide commitment to continue to protect the elite at the expense of forget the poor, at the expense of the country. The country's core interests. I mean, it's a remarkable outlier, this country, given its geography, given its population, given where it is and what other countries are doing in the region.
That's correct. That's correct. And I think it's also a lot of short-term objectives are built into this. If I'm the finance minister and my life is on fire in the line of fire because the IMF is asking for revenues, and that's where the IMF becomes part of the problem, because they have strict requirements of how much revenue you need to raise in a very short period of time without necessarily specifying where to raise it. They do say in their reports, you need real estate tax, you need this, but they say, okay, you need to raise this much revenue. The finance minister goes to the FBR, and then as the culture of using trade policy as a source of revenue generation comes in place, everything is geared towards meeting the IMF requirement without focusing on the structural foundations on which your industry is standing.
And then it doesn't help to have irrational approaches to, for example, the US dollar rate and things like that, which in retrospect now maybe isn't all that irrational, because these are all things that are connected to each other.
One of the things that we economists are now realizing is that many economically irrational policies like SROs are actually politically optimal within that equilibrium.
So you said this the other day, and I thought I was going to write a whole LinkedIn post on this because I think it's brilliant, and I deliberately didn't because I was hoping you would say it again. I want you to repeat that exactly the way you framed it.
So a lot of the policies that we think are economically irrational, like a fixed exchange rate regime or SROs, protecting the sugar industry out of the way, all these are policies that might sound economically irrational, but they are politically optimal. In other words, the political incumbents favor those policies because that economic irrationality protects them.
Yeah. I think, so this has been even more fun than I thought it would be. At least for me, I hope the people that get to watch this will find it to have been as illuminating as it is. I wonder so the next part of the conversation I wanted to have with you, Doc, is where do we go from here? What next? There's a whole range of questions, but I'm also conscious about your time today. And I'm thinking maybe we should have a separate session on where to go. But just to drop a few thoughts with you, and maybe you want to respond to them in kind of summary form, and we can revisit in a longer conversation. The first is, the world is now deliberalizing. So whatever international pressure you could have brought to bear, which didn't work anyway, now even that pressure is easing up. And there might be good reasons to. As I said, for me, for example, I'm not sure you want to open up to India willy-nilly, because of what it might end up doing in terms of the ability of Indian businesses just on pure hard cash to just buy out vast swaths of Pakistani productivity. And the issue isn't India. If it was Iran, it'd be the same. If it was Turkey, it'd be the same. Another associated question is, the current focus on the GCC. What kind of trade policies might benefit Pakistan as it enters an era where many assets will be sold to a specific group of countries because of both geostrategic reasons, but also economic compulsion. And then I guess the bigger question is, if we've acknowledged that the elite are this way, and we also almost know for sure that somebody like Ishaq Dar is invariably either already or soon going to be back in the saddle, then what pathway is there out of this?
So, this is not a unique equilibrium. In a lot of countries, you've had sectors that were traditionally protected by the state, and they were pressures to liberalize, and they responded in a very similar way.
But none of those countries are doing well.
Exactly. And so, trade in Egypt, for example, in fact, I wrote a very similar paper in Egypt where I showed how the cronies in the Mubarak era got a lot of protection, and in the wake of an EU pressure to liberalize. So trade policy substitution is global, and politics of trade policy exists in every country, including the United States. But this equilibrium is shaped by, is broken on many occasions. In Turkey, for example, if you were in Turkey of late 1970s, early 1980s, the trade associations that mattered were the TUSIAD. Those were the trade associations. Think of those trade associations as being controlled by people in Ankara, in Izmir, some of these big trading centers. Now, Turgut Özal's reforms, which made small and medium enterprises more productive, more export-oriented, led to the rise of the Anatolian tigers. And the whole political and geopolitical equilibrium shifted, because now there were a new set of actors who were more powerful.
And in fact, the AKP is a direct product of those reforms.
And those reforms were so dramatic that at a time when TUSIAD, much like APTMA, was the most powerful actor, everybody would turn to them. Today, they have difficulty to select their secretary general, their office bearers. And which is the industry? It's the MUSIAD. It's this ARC party-supported industry. These industrialists are connected with the outside world. When they prevail on Turkey's foreign office, they prevail and say, we want contracts in that country. We want more export-oriented policy in this sector or that sector. Now, Turkey is going through its own unique set of challenges at the moment with a similar insistence on a controlled and managed exchange.
And a similar dynamic between economic irrationality and political optimization.
Absolutely. But the fact remains that equilibrium changed when you had a new set of industrialists who had voice. Now, to change the equilibrium, I think that we need to start from below. We need to have conversations with people who may not be that powerful. So, for example, imagine if the Chinyote sheikhs or people around the Sialkot and the GT Road corridor were coming more and more into the parliament. They were becoming more successful. They will be driving in the driving seat. They'll be driving policy. For any country to benefit from an FTA or trading opportunity, you need to have a strong knowledge base. One of the things that I've discovered is that we do not have good evidence base. And I'm saying this because people in the government, people in the NGO sector and international donors listen to your podcast. I think the most fundamental reform we could do is to create an evidence base, a database for these issues. And so just to put it more concretely, when I was working on this project, I realized that I need numbers for each sector for how much value added there is, how much they are exporting, what is the output. We don't have those numbers on a consistent basis. Why? Because there is a census for manufacturing industries that is done very infrequently. The last one was done in 2016, I think, and the data has just been released. Even that is not being released fully. Now, for a country where large-scale manufacturing is declining or stagnant, where exports and productivity are facing major challenges, it is criminal that we do not have data at regular intervals, every 2-3 years, a big census of manufacturing industries. What are they doing? Which sectors they are going? I mean, at this moment, the vehicle, the motor vehicles, the motorcycle production has decreased and their sales have fallen. This is a crucial fact for me because it is telling me that the lower middle income class is suffering. Well, that's one indicator, right? So I think the donors and the government need to put in a framework to understand and to the economy by collecting the data.
I don't know why you insist on the donors though, Doc. I mean, isn't this just a sovereign responsibility? Doesn't any country that has even a modicum of self-awareness and pride and sense of duty invest in this itself?
Absolutely. No, the reason I mentioned donor is that they have leverage, right? And so they can, even the collection of BISP was made possible through the World Bank. That's the creation of the National Socioeconomic Register. It had a sort of local anchoring, but it was enabled by donors. And I'm mentioning donors because they have leverage, and if they want to do something good, they should press. But absolutely, what you're saying, like census, even if you can't do the census for the whole country, at least do the census for. So we need to strengthen these institutions. Then we need to study industry by industry of the impact of a possible opening up of trade with India or trade with China. We always do this. We make these decisions in a sort of without data, in a kind of ignorant way, without understanding what is happening.
Yeah.
So if there's one takeaway from my paper, it is that the devil is in the detail. You need to know how these things are affecting at the level of sectors, at a highly granular level.
I can't thank you enough for making time, and I insist that we gotta, God willing, we gotta do this again very soon. But just an absolute masterclass, Dr. Adeel Malik. I'm so grateful to you, and I hope you'll keep coming back to Tabadlab.
I think it's a great initiative. We need to have more conversations on these issues. I think many times conversations in our country are stuck about individuals, about political parties. But I think the issues that I'm highlighting, or that I highlighted today, are issues that are, long-running issues. And it doesn't matter which government comes in power. What is their debate on reform, on trade policy, is what will determine whether they can meet people's expectations. Because ultimately, the only way out for this country is to have a solid export base. It is not without a reason that 2013 is the year when our trade deficit began to increase. Our exports began to fall, imports were constantly increasing. So unless we solve the productivity and the export riddle, we do not have a geopolitics, we don't have our fiscal house in order, we are not creating jobs for our people. It is the most important issue.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you again for doing this, and I look forward to having you back here real soon.